Hello and welcome to the Thinking Fellows podcast. Today's episode is brought to you by our sponsor, Great Commission Design. Great Commission Design is a web service for churches building and maintaining attractive and easy to navigate websites. Their services include building your church website from the ground up, taking photographs of your church, the service, and even your staff. Perhaps most importantly, they update and help add new information and content to your website like your sermons at no additional cost. Pricing is based on monthly service and starts at $25 a month for churches with an average attendance of 120 people or less. Listeners of the Thinking Fellows podcast can receive 3 months of service for free when they sign up for a year. Simply visit www.greatcommissiondesign.com/thinkingfellows or follow the link that you can find in the show notes. So to start off the show today, I'd like to give some thanks as we're in the spirit of Thanksgiving. First of all, I'd like to say thank you to all the donors who make the Thinking Fellows and every other project at 1517 possible. We also want to thank our listeners who have shared the show with friends, family, and their churches, helping the Thinking Fellows podcast reach over 30,000 unique downloads a month. In October, that meant that 1,000 downloads every day. This is really big news for a show that only releases 4 episodes a month. We also want to say thank you to our international listeners. The top country outside the U.S. who have listeners to the Thinking Fellows podcast are Canada, Australia, the UK, France, Germany, and Norway. Finally, in the theme of Giving Tuesday, we would like to ask everybody who has been impacted by our show or any other project at 1517, please consider donating. A recurring donation of as little as $5 a month can make a huge difference. If 60% of the Thinking Fellows listeners gave $5 a month, we could raise the entirety of the annual budgetary needs for the entire podcast network. If you'd like to give and support the Thinking Fellows podcast in 1517, you can do so by visiting 1517.org/give or follow the link in the show notes.
Hello there, and welcome to the Thinking Fellows podcast. My name is Caleb, and today I'm joined by Doctors Scott Keith, Deen, and Rod Rosenblatt. Adam is out today, but we have Dan on the show again, which is good. It's actually kind of sad that Adam's not on the show, because last time you were both here, made for some exciting conversation. But we will...
What, did you argue?
Yeah, a little bit.
Always.
Oh, good.
Now he won't make fun of me, so...
But some keen listeners might notice that when you're on the show, usually the topic goes philosophical in nature, and that's because Dan is one of the resident philosophers here at 1517, which is a good thing, but sometimes gets him in a little trouble.
We should get him a beer mug that says that. Resident philosopher.
I'll take it.
Yeah.
And I think this might be a good time. We've explained the name of the show before, but one of the reasons that this type of thing makes sense is that the name of the Thinking Fellows isn't because our podcast is for only those who think or something like that, or we try to be the sophisticated podcast. It's because at 1517 we have what's called a Thinking Fellowship, and it's a group of guys who were trained under Dr. Rosenblatt or Dr. Montgomery, or both, and in certain fields, but they've, while they all have studied theology, they've all studied also philosophy and history and things like that, and they've been become experts in different areas and things like that. So we have, Dr. Keith, systematic and historical theology. Adam really focused on the historical side of theology and then moved to teaching history. Dan has a PhD in philosophy. So we have quite a diverse mix on the Thinking Fellowship, and it's nice when we can get more of them involved on this show, because that's really the idea, is to get those voices heard and see what they are talking about and what they can bring to the table. So today we're going to talk about analytic and synthetic categories and philosophy and how that relates to theology, but sort of with the challenge that we don't intimidate the lay listener too much. If those words just confuse you, please don't turn off the podcast. We're going to try to do this in a way that's as understandable as possible, so that even if you haven't read in these areas, which we're assuming most people haven't, you're going to be able to get something out of this podcast, some sort of value from it. I know I have had some new listeners lately. I got talking to some people online and some forums and things like that and recommended the show, and somebody said, hey, I jumped in midway, and some of the shows are really understandable, some of them aren't. So I think that's going to be the challenge today, is to keep this towards sort of our entry-level listener.
No problem.
Yeah. Everybody looks worried.
I'm not worried.
No, I think we can do this. So with that, I'm going to just tell everybody to go check out the 1517 Podcast Network. We have a group of now 12 shows on there. I'm not sure when this episode's going to air. For listeners, a little inside information, we've been doing a lot of diverse recording lately. Dr. Keith did some recording at a pastor's conference. We've been recording here at the house, and we're going to do some recording at Here We Still Stand. So we have a lot of episodes, and I'm still at this point in time working out how to schedule their release, because we don't always go by date. Sometimes, because we record 2 episodes of the same nature next to each other, I like to break those things up.
Let me ask you a question. Am I correct in thinking that Dr. Montgomery did a little of this in the audio series Sensible Christianity?
Yeah, you are. I'd have to look at the lecture numbering to see which one it was,
Okay. But he did.
He does, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, for sure. I can look at that.
But yeah, so you can check this episode out whenever it goes live, or other shows like it, or that support sort of what we do or bounce off of the things we do at 1517.org/podcast. You can see all of the shows there. We've introduced some new seasonal type podcasts as well at the network, so you can go check out those. We have Family Style Theology, and by the time this show's out, Soul of Christianity. Both of those, Family Style Theology is 6 episodes long. Soul of Christianity is 12 episodes long, and both of those can be, downloaded in bulk and then listened to at your leisure. Okay, guys, I'm going to toss it over to Dr. Keith, and we can then kind of get into the main topic of the show.
Yeah, so anytime I bring this up on the show or even in life, I try to convey the story. I believe I was in one of the first classes I ever took with Rod, and so I think I'm probably technically considered a layman now, but I was certainly then. It's my first or second year of college. I had a background in working at camps and construction and things like that when I came to Concordia, so I had zero background in philosophy, had done little to no reading in philosophy and some in theology. And I don't even think it was a philosophy course where this came up. I want to say that it was perhaps the 20th century theology course, which if you knew Rod back then when he was teaching that course, he would, I'll say it nicely, complain about teaching it, that he didn't like the subject matter at all.
I had to spend years on it in liberal Lutheran seminaries.
Yeah. But if you are somebody that took that course from him way back when, you probably, I would guess, because I do, you might count it as one of the most valuable courses you took while you were at Concordia at that time. For me, it was. I mean, it introduced me to a landscape that I wouldn't have otherwise known at all. In fact, Caleb, who just graduated a few years ago, that course is not part of the catalog any longer, and in his graduate studies has had to do some catch-up on 20th century theology and 20th century theologians, because doing a degree in Europe, it's
expected that you are well aware of it.
Yeah.
It's expected that you know it, and your profs will probably be,
part of it.
Yep. Yeah.
When I was at Westmont, I wanted to entitle the course "The Greased Slide into Oblivion."
Yeah, I know.
And the registrar, a wonderful lady, said, "Rod, I can't do that. I can't put that in." I said, "Well, it's what it is."
That's funny. So I think it was in that course, probably because, the theology is the grease slide into oblivion. You introduced us and me into this idea that the analytic philosophers were of some help in this area, right? Because if you're not familiar with 20th century theology, you're dealing with Protestant liberalism and neo-orthodoxy primarily, both of which do not deal with theology from the perspective of evidence on the whole.
Correct.
Or verifiable statements and language. They deal with it based on feelings in some cases, and unverifiable
The
ideas.
sophisticated will use the later Wittgenstein. We're doing a language game.
Yeah. Other types, I was going to say my last one would be other types of language, right? This is another type of language
Yep.
that we're using. It's not
Yep.
everyday language. And so you introduced, I believe, again in that class, us to this idea that the analytic philosophers would sometimes use three categories of language. The first one is analytic. We'll get into what that means. The second one's synthetic. And the last one is, I've interchanged them, and you can correct me, nonsensical or meaningless.
Both valid.
Yeah. So that's what I want to go through today. And the reason I would like to go through is because in most areas of life, learning those three categories of language has changed my world. Not just in theology, but in the way that I look at evidence in daily life, in the way I argue with my wife, which is sometimes not helpful. But all of these things, because it's so helpful to know, or to be able to ask, or to be able to sort of dig down on what kind of statement is that's being given to me as evidence, right?
Right.
And so basically what I wanted to do today is to sort of go through what these three statements are, sort of how did they come to us, and how are they helpful in the realm of theology and philosophy. So, Dan, do you want to introduce them?
Sure. So, I met these categories with Rod too. I'll do a little bit of what you just did, except I do remember these categories of statements coming up all the time. I mean, it was an
me too.
apologetics class, the 20th century theology class,
Analytic philosophy,
the philosophy of religion class.
philosophy of religion, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
They popped up all over the place, and they are important. You mentioned that these categories were the ones that kind of provided some meat to Christian claims, and we'll say in the mid 20th century. Ironically, though, the philosophers of that time were very anti-Christian. So there's a neat little kind of nuance here in the terms of the fact that this categorization was actually going to be used to expose and to deflate Christianity.
That was the goal.
That was the goal, but it turned out that the Christians who ran from these categories ended up deflating Christianity,
Right.
versus the ones who faced it head on.
Yeah, probably not the first time God has used evil for good.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know. Okay. But interestingly enough, the ones I'm jumping the gun a little bit because I just wanted to put this out there, that one does have to know that with the fall of what I'm sure we'll talk about, I'll let Rod talk about this in a little bit, logical positivism, we have kind of reintroduced a much more sophisticated sense of language games that in some sense has insulated Christianity from critique again, right? And it's unfortunate because these categories these were the categories that the Christian philosophers didn't pick up. They were more than willing to kind of to critique, but then once it fell apart on its own, they reintroduced a sense of kind of Christian metaphysics that has, I think, to this day, held the kind of analytic philosophy of religion back. And it's only held it back in this way. We've got a wonderful environment now at the university where you can go and be a Christian philosopher, but nobody listens to you because you've insulated yourself by not adhering to these distinctions between analytic, synthetic, and meaningless. So with that on the table, these categories are mid-20th century analytic philosophy. And while everyone will say, oh, well, those categories, any philosopher you go talk to, oh, well, those categories are kind of, old-fashioned or whatever, they still very much make their way into the current conversation.
Well, that's a good thing because you don't want the discussion of what's true to degenerate into what's in vogue.
Yeah, I'm with you there. Yeah.
That isn't helpful at all.
Right.
Yeah.
If anybody's going to defend X being true, it better be the philosophers.
Right.
And it's just, in my mind, it's just a reality that understanding these categories, whether it's in theology, I think Christian theology and Christian truth claims are the only ones that survive this in the realm of religion.
Correct.
But two, just learning these things for your overall daily, how do I know X, Y, or Z to be verifiable or not verifiable, or what kind of statement is that? Or, boy, it seems like that person is really looking for a standard from me that could never be met. Why is that?
Right.
Or it seems like that person believes they're making a truth claim, but they're really just giving me their feelings, which could never be verified.
Right.
Yeah, that type of thing.
Right.
So,
Good. So with that in mind, the categories themselves are relatively simple. Again, they're coming out of early 20th century philosophy, where both in Great Britain and I would say to some extent America, we had this kind of linguistic turn.
Right, but not the continent.
Not the continent. Nope.
Yep.
In fact, these categories came out in terms of rebellion against what was going on the continent with Hegel, and then on English soil, T.H. Bradley.
Yep.
F.H. Bradley.
F.H. Bradley.
F.H. Bradley. And we won't go into any detail of what they had to say. Just go try reading them, and then you'll see why I think analytic, synthetic, and meaningless become important categories. But in brief, analytic statements, and so again, we're talking about statements and how we can know their truth value in relation to their mapping of a real world outside of ourselves. So an objective world, our language has to map it in some way. That's just a basic assumption of communication. The analytic statements are those that are simply true by definition. So a statement is analytic if it's true, if it can only be true, or if it's true in terms of you understanding what the definition of the terms are.
Right.
So, for instance, the classic one: all bachelors are unmarried males.
Yep.
You do not need to go look to the world to see if that statement is true. Once you understand what a bachelor is and what an unmarried male is, logically, they're formal statements. So these, if you want to kind of see how these kinds of statements work largely in a much larger context, these are your basic mathematical axioms. A equals A, right? That doesn't really tell us much. It's analytically, it's true by definition. It's a starting place. And so analytic statements are these kind of formal statements, but insofar as they're analytic, they don't really tell us much about the world, right? If I were to stand in front of my class and just spout off to a bunch of students analytic statements, they would probably ask for their money back. Because if I sat there and just told them all day that all bachelors are unmarried men, all ophthalmologists are doctors, Scott Keith is Scott Keith, Dr. Rosenblatt is Dr. Rosenblatt, right? These statements, they don't tell us much. So they're really important as structures and foundations of thought in terms of, it's nice to know that all bachelors are unmarried males, but they're kind of, they're limited in what they can do.
Wittgenstein compared them to a scaffolding. Think of a cathedral.
right. I think of it that way too, yeah.
You can tell a little bit about, if you lifted off the scaffolding and moved it into farmland, what could you know about the cathedral? Not much.
Right.
You could tell its shape, maybe.
Basic shape,
Its height.
basic height, width, breadth.
But you'd have no idea what it was made of or any of the things that really interest us.
Right. And this is where these kinds of statements become important to the field that I did a little bit more work in terms of philosophy of science, because historic philosophy of science was geared at trying to understand the foundations of scientific practice itself.
Defining it.
So our framework, we wanted these analytic statements to be the kind of core and the framework of all scientific practice, because again, if they were mathematically, logically valid in terms of A equals A and these perfect frameworks, then we could build and we could do the synthetic enterprise, which will lead us to the next kind of a statement, where we then kind of fill in the content of those analytic statements or how those analytic statements relate to an objective world outside of us. And they were true regardless of what kind of worldview or what other kind of cultural baggage you bring to it, because they're truths of logic.
Yeah, I sometimes will say that you don't have to investigate these statements to see if they're true or false, because they're just different definitional.
Pure formalisms.
And sometimes I'll go very basic on it. I've never really had anybody sort of verify as if this is a good way of doing it. I'll sometimes just use something as simple as 2 + 2 = 4.
Sure.
It's an analytic statement.
Sure.
Once you understand the concept of 2, when somebody has just taught you the basic concept of here's a pencil, here's another pencil, now you have 2 pencils. You stick 2 more on those, and now you're just counting, right? You're not investigating, other than saying, well, okay, how many pencils do I have? Maybe I have 4, but it's just you have 2. I gave you another 2. Now you have 4. Once you've learned the concept of what the word for means, what the word to means,
Equal sign.
what the equal sign means, what the plus sign means.
Right.
Once you've learned the basic concepts, there's nothing else to know about that. You know, it's true. And it's true analytically.
By definition.
By
By
definition.
definition.
The test for the analytic statement is to simply deny it. And if its denial entails a contradiction, you are most likely dealing with an analytic statement.
Right. 2 plus 2 equals 5, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Or just simply put that 2 plus 2 does not equal 4.
Oh, yeah.
And there's another thing I think we should at least mention, and that is there are some human beings who are wired to try to defend that real knowledge has to meet this goal
Yep.
of 100% certainty, or
Right.
it isn't knowledge.
Right.
They drive me absolutely crazy, but they really think that anything less is Las Vegas
Well, and I'm jumping
or worse.
I'm jumping the gun a little bit here, but I would say most people that believe they have sort of an academic rejection of the faith, of the Christian faith, they have that because they think it's impossible to get this type of truth out of it.
Yeah, very, very important.
And they want, you know, when they say, well, there's not enough evidence to believe in Christianity, and you say, well, what do you mean? They mean analytic statement.
Yep.
They mean definitional. They mean
Yep.
100% certainty.
Yep.
And
Think
again-
in theology, Anselm,
Yeah.
the ontological argument.
Yeah.
Now, that is an unusual argument. I'm being nice. It is unique. But most of us operate in a different realm day to day, and I think we should also in theology.
Yeah.
We haven't gotten to synthetic yet, but I think that's where we belong.
Well, I'm just before we jump again. I hope it's not jumping the gun too much. But one of the things that terrifies me a little bit is that the students I meet at the university, a lot of them think that their daily lives are. I mean, decisions made in their daily lives are made on the basis of 100% certainty. Which is, you have to have a certain amount of the invincibility syndrome, in a sense,
Yeah.
to believe
Yeah.
that the decision to get in your car and drive on the 405
Yeah.
is, certain, and that you will certainly get to your destination, and
Yeah.
that certainly everything's going to be okay. But a lot of them, I think, Dan, operate there.
Yeah, I deal with a lot of freshmen, so they're just look at me starry-eyed,
Yeah.
dazed and confused. But we track this out in the class, whether or not if you press the button on the walk pathway and the little legs open, start flashing, indicating for you to walk. Are you going to make it to the other side without dying?
Yeah.
They'll say yes, but I said, are you assured of that? Are you certain you're going to make it to the other side? And they all will quickly then backpedal and say, oh no, anything, I could get hit by a car.
When I do this, I
whatever.
I do a very simple. If you have a car and you hop in your car, and these days you don't necessarily have to put the key in, but let's say you have to put the key in or push the button or whatever, are you certain it's going to start?
Yeah.
Not my 03.
Are you certain
I'd
it's
pray
going to
every
start? Now,
time.
the funny, when you start, most of them say, yeah, it's
Right.
because their experience to date has,
Right.
but they don't link it to their experience until you point it out. And I think that's a lot of people. I think that's a lot of people, and I think that's what you're talking about, Rod. I think a lot of people are hardwired to think this way, that everything is sort of just axiomatic in life.
Yes.
Cars go, people live.
Look in the history of philosophy, Descartes in France. What he was attempting to do was to do everything under an analytic umbrella that worked.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, you miss a lot of pieces, though, because these statements can't tell you anything of value about the thing. So you miss ethics entirely, right? You can say that all bachelors are unmarried men, but that doesn't tell you if that's a good thing, a bad thing, indifferent.
No, they're formalisms.
It tells you
Yeah.
nothing about the man who's a bachelor.
Yep.
Nope.
Why
That's
he's
right.
a bachelor.
Yeah. Well, he's an unmarried man. Well, I knew that.
Yeah.
So if you want to get real kind of dicey, right? Where I think Rod was going a little bit with the Christianity type claims is the circularity in analytic statements can be troublesome when you're trying to actually have a conversation about the contents of something like Christianity.
Sure.
So one could always do the kissing Hank's butt argument, right? With
Yeah.
analytic statements, right? So why are you a bachelor? Because I'm an unmarried man. Yeah, I know, but what does it mean to be an unmarried man? Well, it means to be a bachelor. It's
Yep.
like, okay, I got a bachelor, unmarried man, bachelor, got it, right? But we do this, right? We kept, and just for the audience to be aware when we start rolling down these pathways, right? Well, why do you believe in God? Because the Bible tells me so. But okay, but why do you believe in the Bible? Well, because it's the Word of God. Right? You're at that level.
Same thing.
You formalize and you're treating the Scriptures and God and His existence as an analytic statement.
Yep.
And insofar as you're treating it as an analytic statement, it makes no more sense.
Yep.
It's a pure formalism that doesn't actually tell us anything about the content of our world outside of maybe a very basic axiomatic formalism.
Or somebody could present a different definition, right? They could say the Quran is the word of God.
Sure.
Now you have two words claiming to be the same definition. So how do you work those out?
How do you adjudicate between the two of those?
Which is a perfect transition to the synthetic statement.
Good. We're taking up a lot. We're burning time
It's
here.
a perfect transition because the synthetic statement is going to be the second class of statement where the way I like to do this in my class, I've never heard a philosopher do this, but that's because philosophers are very nitpicky about the language they use. But basically, you have a sentence that is synthetic with the outside world around you. It somehow synthesizes the word and the world have to match up, right? So a synthetic world is going to be true whether or not the statement, or I guess you could even break it down to the word, whether or not the statement or the words actually match to a world outside of ourselves, something that is then going to have to be verifiable or testable in terms of saying, hey, the cat is on the mat. That statement will only be true or false dependent upon whether or not the cat is actually on the mat at a given time.
Or water is composed of hydrogen and oxygen.
Right. Or
all of science falls here.
Yes. Or to go back to the bachelor example, so analytic, bachelors are unmarried males. Synthetic, all bachelors are good looking, right? That's a statement that you can't get the truth of that statement by simply playing with the words, because I guarantee all of us have experience with, unhandsome bachelors.
Sure.
Right? But the statements could be true if it matches an actual state of affairs in the world, right? So the denial of these statements do not entail contradictions, because I can conceive of the world as existing with non-handsome bachelors. And there's nothing in that statement that entails a logical contradiction. All science falls here.
Ought to fall there.
Most of our actual practical lives falls here. And even theology, to some extent, ought to fall here.
Yes.
Not in the analytic statements. Because
now,
again,
it's only fair to tell your listeners, we are a tiny band of people who hold that degree of rigor, that is synthetic and verifiable, could possibly be true in the realm of theology.
Right.
That's only truth in marketing.
Yep.
We're right, but nobody else is interested, or they think we're nuts.
Yeah.
Yep.
Hey guys, I'm going to cut you off real quick so we can take a break, but then we'll go ahead and finish out this side of the story. Hello there, and welcome to our break. I'm just going to briefly talk about the 1517 Academy. This is a series of, well, not necessarily a joint series, but a series of lectures that we have on the 1517 site, where various teachers at 1517 come to, I give really high-level lessons and courses for free. We have that. It's at 1517.org. You can click the Academy button. And we have a new series of lectures on there by Dr. Francisco on apologetics. It's a 5-part series where he does 5 different lessons: intro to apologetics, historical method, things that we've done on this show, but in a more formal setting where we are conversational. These are actually lectures, and there are even notes and quizzes there that you can partake into to kind of test your knowledge out of the course as well. So those are purpose-built, and we're really trying to provide as high-quality material there as possible. And I think, it's free, so there's really no reason not to go sign up. All it requires is your name and your email address at the 1517 site. And let us know what you think of those, too. You can always write in the show. We always try to point sort of outside of this show for more resources than just ourselves. And so let me know what you think about those Academy lectures in emails to us, and if they're helpful to you and what other materials you might like to see in the future. because we are always expanding those classes.
Or at least log on and see what a good-looking picture Adam took for the
He
academy.
did, didn't he? That's good. We have some really nice artists and photographers here at 1517.
Yeah.
Really.
I mean, they even made Adam look good. So.
Oh, low shot. Okay. Well, that might be a synthetic statement. So why don't we roll into finishing our definition of synthetic and how that affects our theological and daily lives.
Let me give you an example that sounds a little strange, but I'll explain it. Christianity is historical. Answer from the rest of the world: every religion is historical. Response: granted. But in Christianity, it's historical in a way that's vulnerable. That sounds like a weakness, but it's not. It's a strength. Why? Because if you're talking about synthetic statements, such as Jesus rose from the dead after 3 days, then they have to be, in principle, capable of being falsified or overthrown or disconfirmed by fact. That eliminates most religions of the world. Somebody said earlier, I think only Christianity survives this, and that just could be true. So that kind of vulnerability is a strength. Christianity can, in principle, be factually overthrown.
Right, and we would say that all religions are historical for the mere reason that they were taught at some point in history.
Yeah, some guy invented one.
Yeah. Let's go on to nonsensical. The nonsensical statements are most religious statements out there.
Yep.
Right? Most statements about belief and religion
Yep.
are nonsensical. So what's that one all about,
It's
Dan?
technical use of meaningless without discernible empirical meaning. That is, you can't think of any way they could be overthrown. They're either totally interior or put out of the realm of scientific investigation in principle.
Or investigation.
Yeah, any legitimate investigation is ruled out.
Right.
Yeah,
What Dr. Montgomery illustrates with a physicist who wrote on a student's paper, this isn't right, it isn't even wrong.
Right. That's a good definition of the meaningless statement. Just one that there's no possible way to get at its truth value, either analytically or synthetically.
Yep.
Right. So it falls again outside those categories. And again, mentioned already the religious statements, but a lot of the existential type statements as well. Even the ones that we take to be pretty darn good, like I feel hungry right now.
Yeah.
That's philosophically a meaningless statement because you can't verify it empirically
can't crawl inside
or analytic. Yeah, you can't get inside. Now you can observe my behavior, that
Yep.
I'm going to go eat and things like that, but unless I actually declare to you that I'm hungry, there's no way for you to know whether that's, unless you can get inside my head and have the exact same state of affairs that I'm having at that moment, there's no way to know.
Yeah.
So what are some examples of religious claims that fall into the nonsensical category?
Well, I'll give a very evangelical one. Karl Barth, one of the greatest theologians of the 20th century, wanted to affirm the gospel, as you and I understand the gospel. Christ died for the sins of the world and then rose to verify it. But he was convinced that higher critical method of the scriptures was legit. So what did he do? Well, he discovered another guy's work where he could make the distinction in the German language between two words, Historie and Geschichte, both translated history. Now, what he said was, Jesus rose, but not in the realm of history, which could be examined. He rose in history in the Geschichte sense, which ruled out all secular criticism. Now that's clever, but again, it makes it in principle impossible to check out whether Christianity's claim was true. And the obvious is that all of this took place in the world that we know day by day. He either rose in this world, where it could be examined, or the reason you can't examine it wasn't in this world, but in some strange world that we can't get at. Mm-hmm. That's one illustration. There are many that are worse. He was trying to do it so the gospel survived.
Yeah, and flip it on that. I mean, if Adam was here, he could tell you better at how at least the Quran came into existence with the angel coming in one ear and going out the other of the Prophet Muhammad in a cave in the desert where there was nobody else around.
Yep.
He was by himself, already probably hungry because he was on a one of his fasts or whatever. Mm-hmm. And again, that's really hard if one were to come back and say the Quran is true because of that experience in the desert. That's a really difficult statement to get at.
Sure.
Again, synthetically, analytically.
Sure.
And most philosophers are going to say that does not help at all at getting at the truth of whether or not the Quran is a real, legitimate, and there's just no way to do it. And and it looks like that was kind of the way that Muhammad wanted that to be.
Right.
Right? As opposed to, say, Jesus of Nazareth, who did these things not in a corner.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And said before he died, I'll tell you what I'm going to do, and nobody got it at all.
Mm-hmm. But you could take some, I just pulled I don't want to rip on other religions, but here's Buddha. The universe itself is change, and life itself is but what you deem it.
Or how about we are all gods?
We are all gods. How do you verify that?
Right. How do you know that your Mormon faith is true? Because I felt a burning in the bosom.
Yep. There's another one.
Yeah. I mean, this is what I was saying at the beginning before we started this section on nonsensical statements. Most religious statements are of this nature.
Are technically without sense.
Yeah.
And on the non-religious side, in the history of philosophy, again, the continental side of philosophy tended this way.
Yes.
To make nonsensical statements. So I don't have one quickly. You probably have your Hegel one.
Well, no, not by a series of memorized statements, but he operated and wrote as if he could overlook the world from outside the world and tell the rest of us schlubs what he was watching. Nobody's got that kind of viewpoint.
Right.
Including Hegel.
Or if you want to move into 21st century French philosophy with people like Foucault, I mean, again, they being radical kind of constructivists and existentialists are going to reduce everything to kind of a game of power.
Yeah.
But the only way
no matter what it looks like.
No matter what it looks like, it always is power. So
Yep.
there's some sort of power struggle going on. And that means that, again, they're going to step back somehow, get outside the system and look
see
in.
what it is.
Right? Whereas the rest of us are just kind of stuck in it. We're not allowed to do that or can't do that.
Yep.
Right? And there you run into a kind of verification synthetic problem again.
Yep.
So I'm going to bring this back around. So I introduced this by saying I learned this in some of your classes, and I remembered it being in 20th century theology where I first heard it. And you said you wanted to name that class the Grease Slide into Oblivion. But I think we've come to why you wanted to name it that, right? So continental philosophers in the 20th century, primarily in the 20th century, started making Christian claims that were nonsensical in nature. They were technically meaningless statements,
Yes.
right? And that was antithetical to what Christianity actually was and how the scriptures actually present Christ and him crucified and risen from the dead.
Correct.
As synthetic statements.
Yep.
In other words, Christianity is historical in a particular sense because if Christ is not raised, the whole thing is wrong.
Yeah, a lot of what we're saying is in 1 Corinthians 15.
Right. And so if and I think I've heard you say it this way before, if the bones of Christ can be found somewhere in the near, in Jerusalem, the game changes here. With this, Christianity is likely not true.
Yep.
Right? And we
Yep.
ought not be then Christians.
Yeah, that Paul says it in 1 Corinthians.
Yeah, 15, 17.
Yep.
If Christ be not raised, we are of all men most miserable. We've deceived ourselves, we've deceived others, and our faith is in vain.
Yep.
That makes Christianity uniquely synthetic, whereas other religions aren't. This Grease Slide into Oblivion is when our own theologians abandon that uniquely verifiable character of Christianity and say, it's just like every other religion, actually, that makes these odd religious statements that make you feel very good, and maybe get you a seat back at the table at the academic parties, but are technically nonsense and mean nothing.
Yep.
That sounds good.
real damaging.
That's accurate.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the big things it's done in, conversations today as part of that landslide is change definitions of things like faith. I mean, so a lot of it'll, since they're all meaningless statements, then it's just a matter of faith and who has which
man.
things like
Yeah.
that, right?
Well,
Yeah.
whereas the
That's
Apostle Paul describes why he has faith in 1 Corinthians 15, it's on the basis of evidence.
Yep.
1 Corinthians
Yeah.
15,
Yep.
1 through 6.
So, yeah.
It'd be worth us doing a whole show on what America today imagines that the word faith means.
Oh yeah, it's a huge problem. I mean, the conversations. I don't know if Dan shared this. Conversations I've had with scientists, a lot of the fallout happens around that word. Where I say, well, I take faith to mean, something that can have a basis in fact or observable evidence. And they say, well, no. Faith is distinctly an emotional trust in a higher being. And I go, okay, we are really 10 miles apart here. But for I think most people, when they say faith, that's what they're appealing to.
Most of, I won't say our pastors, although I'll wink when I say I won't say our pastors, I think would define faith more along the lines of an emotional
It's a trust.
reaction. And it is a
It's
trust.
a trust.
I
But
mean,
it's got to be a trust in something.
Right.
Yeah.
In
Something.
So when
something.
we talk about, we should do
The something is the
Yeah.
real.
The something is important.
We
here.
should do a full show on this, but classically in Lutheranism, when we say faith, we would say it's made up of three parts, right? There's the knowledge. You're getting just the bare facts.
What the
happened,
Apostles' Creed
right?
says.
Right. And I'd even say if you want to know some of that too, go to 1 Corinthians 15, 1 through 6. You're going to get just the bare facts. Christ died according to Scriptures. He rose again according to Scriptures. People saw him as he was risen. Boom. Right? There's the facts. There's the ascent, and that's the sort of, you come to a level of maybe plausibility that this is actually could have happened.
I think this might be true.
I think this might be true. And our theologians would say those first two don't save. Right?
They're necessary, but they cannot save.
They're foundational. They're necessary. You got to have them, but they don't save. And so when we even talk about synthetic statements, we're getting to that plausibility level. We're kind of getting to that assent level with it, right? We're saying,
that's as far as an apologist can go.
even on the basis of evidence, looking, did Christ actually raise from the dead? You can look at all the evidence and you can get to the point of, this likely happened. The evidence is in your favor. This is a plausible argument. But that's not saving faith, right? What is saving faith is that knowledge and assent, and added to that trust, which is only worked by the power of the Holy Spirit through the proclaimed word of Christ. Period. I mean, that's Romans 1:16, Romans 10:17, the first chapter of 1 Corinthians, almost the entire first chapter of 1 Corinthians. You're looking at this reality that if you have a trust which holds firmly to Christ as your only hope for salvation, that's a miracle that's happened within you by the power of the Holy Spirit. But that trust is not based on, you're not trusting in the trust. You're trusting that Christ is God incarnate.
Died for your
sins and rose again. And that is based on what you know from the Scriptures, which, again, you can look at the verifiability of that.
And it's a tricky, again, the relationship with pastors and philosophers and the academy is always tricky on this one, because it looks like, right, you've got a contingent fact of the world guaranteeing a necessary truths. Right? And that's mind-blowing in the way it should be, because we're dealing with God entering the world. Right?
That's right. The incarnation is...
But the problem is people will then kind of, just because of the way we are as humans, kind of go more one way than the other. So they'll go more towards the necessary truths or more towards the contingent truths, instead of kind of holding those in a kind of
balance,
Lutheran paradox or a tension. Just a tension would be okay, and give us a little latitude to kind of play with it, which I think the three categories that you mentioned of the early reformers gives us that latitude.
Sure it does.
But we don't like to have the conversation about what that latitude might mean.
Well, and I wish more of just in Christianity generally, more people understood faith consisting of those three parts.
I sometimes wonder whether most Americans believe what Mark Twain once wrote. Faith is believing what you know ain't true.
Yeah.
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 And
I think they do.
And they'll point to
Well,
to
that's
doubting.
sort of what that
do.
Bart statement implies as
And
well.
we don't have time for it, but this is
No, no.
this gets me back to when we were doing the apologetics series, Rod, and you and I spent some time on the difference between knowledge and faith.
Mm-hmm.
You know, what are you getting from the facts as you know them from the scriptures, right? That can be in the realm of epistemology, which
Sure.
is not the same thing necessarily. You have to have that knowledge, but that knowledge does not mean saving faith.
Right.
Even the devils had that knowledge.
That's right. Scripture says that.
As scriptures say. So,
Well, we are at time. Thank you for the great conversation on this episode. I think we were able to keep it so that people will be able to follow along.
I hope
maybe
so.
have
If not,
to-
they can email you
follow-up
questions.
Yeah, we'll take questions, and as we said here that we are going to sort of expand on these topics. This has given us more ideas for future episodes, and we'll have stuff to do after Here We Still Stand, and the various other things that happen late October.
All right.
All right, we'll catch you
Thanks
next
for coming,
time.
Dan.
Thank you.